Hello, and welcome back to our look at the physical context of the Gospel of John. We are going to try to finish it out in this video, which means we will be moving fast and may skip over some things that you would rather see covered. If that happens, please feel free to let me know, and I will do my best to answer any questions or maybe record another video to expand on what we miss. I will be referencing things covered in previous videos, so I encourage you to watch those videos in order to get the full context. As I record this, in the church calendar, we are in the season of Lent, which ends with Holy Week and is capped by Easter. The rest of the book of John, with the exception of chapter 21, takes place over those last 7 days that we now call Holy Week or Passion Week. As we approach the end of Jesus' life, this gospel includes more and more details. We start with Jesus' return to Bethany to the house of Lazarus, Martha, and Mary. At this feast, Mary anoints Jesus' feet with a costly bottle of perfume. Maybe someday I'll do a video about the spice route and where that perfume might have come from, but that could get quite long. So here I'll just show a few pictures of perfume bottles from that time. Also, money values are hard to pin down, but it seems that 300 denarii would be around a year's wage. In verse 12, we have the event that we commemorate as Palm Sunday. Jesus enters Jerusalem on a donkey to the waving of palm branches. The modern route is walked by pilgrims each year waving palm branches. This might not have been the exact route, but he went from Bethany to Jerusalem, so it really can't be more than a couple hundred meters off in any direction. There are many other things of significance in this chapter. Another agricultural illustration about a grain of wheat, another thematic comparison of Jesus to light, several references to the Tanakh or Old Testament, etc. A lot of the things from here on out in the book would be discussed in a commentary and probably in helpful ways. So we're going to skip a lot of those sorts of things and focus on a few special images. The next 5 chapters encompass the words that Jesus spoke to his disciples at the Last Supper. I think I need to put in a bit of a caveat here. As we've been working through the gospel, I've several times made comments about chronology, like, this might be the case if we assume that the gospel is chronological. And I should state now, scholars debate whether or not any of the gospels are fully chronological. It is a very culturally Western thing to do, to order events chronologically when telling a story, though even we sometimes organize things more thematically. It's hard to know what approach the gospel writers took, if they tended more towards chronology or more towards theme. There's obviously some of both. John, for example, pretty clearly starts with John the Baptist's introduction to Jesus at the beginning of his ministry and ends with his death and resurrection. On the other hand, where there is a miracle followed by a discourse, it's hard to be certain if they happened at the same time or if John put them together thematically. That's to say nothing of possible later editors who maybe didn't know the chronology and rearranged things for their own purposes. One of the big questions of John is the cleansing of the temple. The Gospel of John has Jesus cleansing the temple right at the beginning of the book, while the other Gospels put it at the end of his ministry. It's possible that he cleansed the temple twice at different times in his ministry, but it seems more likely that John just didn't pay strict attention to chronology. And if that's the case, then it's also possible that the Passover mentioned in chapter 6 is the same as the Passover mentioned in chapter 2, which throws our whole chronology into question. And that's fine. We've been using chronology mostly as a tool to work through the book and to discuss some of the claims made by various scholars. We can allow for some uncertainty here. I think I would argue that much of John is chronological. The author uses too many references to time passing for there to be no chronology. However, I also think it's quite likely that some parts were arranged to be thematic. I would suggest that we are similarly uncertain if everything Jesus said in this section that we call the upper room discourse was all said that night, or if he had said similar things before and the author just decided they all fit together thematically. I'm not sure how much of an impact that possibility actually has on our understanding, but it's something that we should keep in mind. Let's talk about the setting of the Passover meal or the Last Supper. The first thing we see in chapter 13 is Jesus taking on the job of a servant and washing his disciples' feet. This is rightly recognized as a significant moment, and various Christians have since incorporated foot washing into religious services or even weddings because of the symbolism. But I do want to point out that for Jesus, this was not merely symbolic. I don't think I have ever attended a wedding where the bride or groom's feet were filthy. The disciples' feet, on the other hand, well, let's review our physical context. It's the spring of the year, so the ground is probably still muddy in some places, dry and dusty in others. 2, they've been crossing back and forth over the Kidron Valley, and this is the likeliest place to still have water and mud during the season. 3, the temple is still functioning during this period, which means there would have been blood, guts, and ashes to deal with, along with the water used to clean them up. Likely, at least some of that would have made its way into the streets and valleys of Jerusalem. And 4th, because of the temple and the fact that it was an agrarian society, living animals would also have been common, which would have made animal dung very common. All of these factors would have made for very dirty feet, and choosing to wash them was no small thing. I don't usually go into much application, but I am going to suggest one here. If someone wants to lead a ministry or a business, but they are not willing to do the metaphorical equivalent of the lowly job of washing feet, maybe cleaning toilets or doing whatever dirty, lowly job needs doing, then they are not acting like Christ, and we should maybe question if they are fit for leading. Now, Jesus didn't wash feet all the time, and pastors shouldn't clean toilets all the time, but if it's something that needs doing, they should be willing to jump in, and if they're not, that can be a red flag. After the feet washing, we continue to the Last Supper. I'm not sure what comes to your mind when you picture the Last Supper. Maybe Leonardo da Vinci's painting or similar artwork comes to mind. It's a scene that many artists have tried to depict, and as artists do, they choose to depict it in different ways depending on their research they have done, their own artistic style, and what they hope to communicate with their intended audience. While paintings like Da Vinci's Last Supper have artistic value and communicate things of substance to the audience, they are also generally not close to reality. So let's talk about what we know about the Last Supper. The Gospel of John tells us both the most and the least about this supper. John doesn't tell us where it took place or who all was present, but it gives details of the foot washing and betrayal that are not included in the other Gospels. Mark and Luke tell us that it was in a large furnished upper room. Matthew and Mark tell us the 12 disciples were in attendance, though there are some indications that other disciples may have been around or helped to serve. All of the Gospels tell us that they reclined at the table. This language, combined with what we know of dining practices around that time, suggest a triclinium type setup. All this taken together tells us several things. First, that the house that was hosting Jesus and his disciples was probably fairly large and owned by a wealthy person. It had an upper room, perhaps designed and furnished to be a triclinium dining space with enough space for 13 people. This signals wealth. And second, while the exact setup could vary, in a typical triclinium there would have been a low table surrounded on 3 sides by couches. The 4th side would be open, probably for servants to bring food and drink. The diners would recline on their left side with their heads toward the table and their feet away. We also know something about the typical seating order. It's possible that Jesus and his disciples didn't practice the normal seating order and sat randomly, but in Luke 14, Jesus gives a lesson teaching his followers not to try to sit in the places of highest honor. And again, in Luke's account of the Last Supper, a dispute arose over who was the greatest. One imagines them fighting for the best seats at the table. At the very least, they would have been aware of the places at the table that were considered the most honorable, and this seemed to impact their practice. This means that what we can deduce about their seating arrangement does have some interesting implications. I found a few sources that disagree on which were the most honorable seats, and likely it varied some depending on the size of the party or the layout of the room. The sources I've found talk about seating for 9 people, not 12 or 13. But most of the more reliable sources seem to agree on this layout. As you enter, on your right is the summus couch, in the middle is the medius, and on the left the imus. And forgive my Latin pronunciations. The host and possibly his family sit on the imus couch. Next to the host on the medius couch is probably the guest of honor. This location seems to be the most honorable for a few possible reasons. First, it is next to the host. Second, it may allow space for that guest to conduct business, as there's room for a servant to approach to bring or take a message. And third, it seems that the rooms were often set up so that this seat had the best view. Most, but not all, sources seem to agree that the seats decrease in honor as you continue around the table from the medius to the summus. It's possible that the ends of both the summus and the imus couches were for servants or people who could act like servants if needed, since they would be more easily able to leave to fetch something. So, if we apply this to the Last Supper, we can make some educated guesses based on what John says. First, we assume that Jesus is acting as the host of the meal, which would place him about here. Second, after he announced in John 13:21 that one of you will betray me, we are given a few significant bits of information. Verse 23 says, the disciple he loved was reclining close beside Jesus. Traditionally, this is understood to be the disciple John and the author of this book, though as we discussed in an earlier video, it's possible that one or both of these assumptions are incorrect. This does seem to be a disciple that Jesus considered a family member, as later on at his crucifixion, he assigns that disciple to care for his mother. We'll call him John for convenience. Verse 24 says, Simon Peter signaled to find out who he meant. This seems to place Peter on the opposite side of the table from John. And again, this seems to fit with what we know of Peter's personality. He had just been rebuked by Jesus washing his feet. It would be like him to take Jesus' exhortation to serve each other to heart and to thus choose the lowliest place at the table. So John leans back against Jesus and asks. Jesus' exact words vary in different Gospels and different translations, but the implication seems to be that his betrayer is sitting close enough to Jesus to dip into the same cup and for Jesus to hand him food. Since Jesus' right side is already taken by John, this leaves his left side as the best place for Judas to be, in the seat of honor. Again, this is somewhat speculative, but it seems to fit both with Judas's desire for power and with Jesus's graciousness in continuing to invite him into his kingdom, even as he knows what Judas has planned. Of course, I'm showing this with the traditional 9 people dining, and this meal apparently had 13. So here are a few more squished in for accuracy, with the recognition that they might have been rearranged slightly differently. After this exchange, Judas leaves, which again may have been normal for a person sitting in that location. The disciples just assumed he had some business to conduct. It is in this intimate setting with his remaining disciples that Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, or communion, as recorded in the Synoptic Gospels, and gives us the upper room discourse as recorded in John. The upper room discourse starts in John 13 and continues through the end of chapter 17. There's a lot of really important material in it, so naturally we're going to skip over most of it. Again, not because it isn't important, it's very important, but that also means that it's been covered well in other places. There are 2 images that Jesus uses that I want to examine briefly. In chapter 14, verse 3, Jesus said he is going to prepare a place for you. This one passage has inspired the imagination of Christians for generations. When I reflect on this, a few of our cultural interpretations come to mind. When I was a child, some of the more common translations used the term mansion instead of dwelling place, which for me and others conjured up images of row after row of huge houses. A few songs also use this image. That's All the Lumber You Sent by Eli in 1998 seems to build on the idea of many mansions, and possibly also the passage in 1 Corinthians 3. Jesus is preparing a place for you, but he only has so much lumber depending on your good works. Big House by Audio Adrenaline was big when I was in high school and college, and honestly is probably closer to the original intent of the passage, with one single mansion with lots and lots of room. To go back to the original context, though, there are a couple of images that Jesus was likely drawing on in this illustration. In the Middle East, even to this day, there is the idea of the Beit, or the father's house. Traditionally, when a son was old enough to marry, he would add on to his father's house, and then he and his bride would live there with the hope that someday their sons would do the same. Today, in the Middle East, you see evidence of this desire to have a continually expanding family in the buildings with the top story left unfinished. Always room for another story to be built should it be needed. In the time of the patriarchs, a similar thing could be accomplished by adding on another section of tent. It's clear from archaeological evidence that this sort of adding on to a building to make a block of living spaces also happened in the Roman era. These conglomerated buildings may have been called insula. It seems like this was the practice Jesus and his disciples would have been picturing, a large insula with room for many different peoples and families. Other places in the New Testament refer to the church symbolically as the bride of Christ, and we can see that symbolism in this story as well. Jesus, the bridegroom, promises to prepare his Beit for his disciples. Jesus concludes this illustration with one more I am statement in response to Thomas's question. I am the way, the truth, and the life. We jump from here to chapter 15 for one more I am statement with one more agricultural illustration. Chapter 15, verses 1 through 10, I am the vine. Jesus expands on this illustration for 10 verses, and other people have done a better job of looking at the theological implications and personal applications of this section than I can do here. What I want to do is mention both the importance of vines in the culture of the time and the fact that there are differences between how their vines and vineyards were likely set up compared to today. First, there is a recurring image in the Bible of what a good life looks like. Every man under his vine and fig tree. And when disaster is decreed, those prophecies are often accompanied by the destruction or failure of those vines and fig trees. Every household would have at least one grapevine, ideally. Typically, it would use the house as support and then provide shade in the summer, maybe for a courtyard or living space on the roof. The vine would also provide grapes for food that could be preserved as raisins or wine to help keep the family through the winter. There were also vineyards, but unlike today, they did not generally use trellises. The vines would grow along the ground, possibly propped up by stones. Some aspects of viticulture haven't changed over time, but the care and harvest of the vines would have been a little different because of this growing pattern, and also their vineyards probably would have been much smaller than some of the large vineyards we have growing today. We're going to end our look at the upper room discussion here with a repeated disclaimer that we skipped a lot. I especially want to acknowledge that I didn't go into how Jewish thought and practice impact our understanding of this Passover meal. Part of this is because of my own uncertainty. The current Passover Seder seems to have developed after this time, and I'm not sure how much we know about how Passover was celebrated at the time of Christ. And I didn't have time to do a lot of research, so maybe someday. For now, we press on. After this long conversation in the upper room, Jesus and his disciples again cross the Kidron Valley and stop in a garden on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. Other Gospels call it Gethsemane, which means oil press. Likely there were olive trees and an oil press near or in the garden. Today, in the traditional location of the garden is a church called the Church of All Nations. And in the garden area of that church, there are some quite ancient olive trees. None of them seem to be over 2,000 years old, but it's possible that their roots date back to that time. One of the interesting things about studying the Bible with the lens of geography is that with locations, patterns emerge that could have otherwise been overlooked. For example, when Jesus is moving back and forth between Bethany and Jerusalem, proceeding down the Mount of Olives, this could have brought to mind previous processions down the Mount of Olives. Well, anyone who travels to the east of Jerusalem probably crosses the Kidron Valley and the Mount of Olives, even when they aren't mentioned by name. A quick Bible search for Kidron or Mount of Olives brings a couple interesting results. The first passage to mention both by name is the story of David fleeing from Jerusalem because of his son Absalom. The story describes how David and his court crossed the Kidron Valley weeping. There are a few exchanges with visitors and priests, and then David continues up the Mount of Olives still weeping. David returns to Jerusalem in 2 Samuel 20, and while the Mount of Olives is not specifically mentioned here, he almost certainly crossed over it again if he was returning from the east. His return is bittersweet, but he returns to face the consequences of his action and try to put his kingdom in order. A second passage that mentions the Mount of Olives is Zechariah 14:4. This is an image of God coming to fight for Jerusalem. He will stand on the Mount of Olives and it will be split down its center. One has to wonder if these passages came to mind for Jesus as he traveled back and forth across the Mount of Olives, or for the authors of the Gospels as they wrote. When John talks about Jesus and his disciples crossing the Kidron in chapter 18, was he echoing how David, Jesus' ancestor, had crossed the Kidron weeping? And when Jesus turns to return with the soldiers that had been sent for him, do we see him, like David, ready to do the unpleasant task necessary for the reclaiming of his kingdom? David's son, Absalom, had been killed in order for David to reclaim his kingdom, but in contrast, Jesus was prepared to give his own life for his kingdom. And once we start seeing echoes from the life of David here, we see them in several other places. There is a passage in 2 Samuel about David conquering Jerusalem that references the blind and lame in connection with the water system. It is a strange passage to try to make sense of, but I think it is significant that in John we see Jesus healing both a lame man in John 5 and a blind man in John 9 in connection with water in Jerusalem. We'll see one more possible connection a little later, but I think there is a pattern throughout this book of not just comparing Jesus to Moses, as we talked about in the first video, but also comparing Jesus to David. John doesn't emphasize genealogy like some of the other Gospels do, but it seems like he chose specific events and locations that compare and contrast with the life of David to show the superiority of Jesus. As chapter 18 continues after Jesus' arrest, we see Jesus pass back and forth between various rulers. I spent quite a bit of time tracing possible locations and routes in a previous video, which I will link to, but I'll try to summarize here. First, Jesus is sent to Annas, who had been the high priest, then to Caiaphas, who was currently the high priest. We're not quite sure where either of them lived, though it seems they may have lived close enough together to share a courtyard. In general, it seems most likely that they lived somewhere in this area called the Western Hill. A few of the suggested locations are highlighted. Other Gospels record that Jesus is sent before the Sanhedrin, but John skips that and takes him directly to Pilate. Several locations for this have been proposed, but this one on the Western Hill seems to be the current favorite, though as far as I know, there's no conclusive evidence. The modern Via Dolorosa starts at this other suggested location as it tries to trace the route Jesus took carrying his cross. This route has devotional significance for pilgrims past and present, but it doesn't have much in the way of archaeological evidence. A more likely route for Jesus from Pilate to the cross is this way. Before being sent to the cross, though, Jesus is flogged, and as part of that process, a crown of thorns is placed on his head in mockery. In our modern times, this seems to be often pictured as barren branches with thorns twisted into a circle. And this is possible, but remember, all of this is happening in the spring of the year. In the spring, even the prickliest bushes sport new leaves. There is speculation on what specific plant was used, and there is no shortage of spiky plants in the area. But because this is spring, all of these plants will have leaves. This is unlikely to be a barren crown of thorns, but rather a verdant wreath with hidden spikes. This is especially significant when we consider what sort of crowns Roman rulers wore. Julius Caesar isn't pictured with the heavy gold crowns of famous European rulers, but with a green laurel wreath, symbolizing his victory. Wreaths of other types of plants were used in similar ways by other leading Romans. This makes the mockery of the Roman soldiers especially sharp and also somewhat ironic, since what seemed like defeat was actually the path of victory for Jesus. In verse 17, Jesus arrives at Golgotha. John tells us that is the name in Hebrew and gives the translation in Greek, place of the skull. This sort of begs the question, why was it called by this name? And several possibilities have been suggested. First, those who favor the Garden Tomb and Gordon's Calvary location suggest that the hill looked like a skull. Gordon's Calvary was suggested because that hill looked a bit like a skull at one point. It looks less skull-like now, which just shows that geological features are unlikely to remain unaltered from Jesus' time until now. While this location is not seriously considered as the actual location of Golgotha, it is possible that there was a skull-like look to the hill where Jesus was crucified. A second possibility is commemorated by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Underneath the location commemorating the crucifixion, there is a chapel called the Chapel of Adam. Tradition locates this as the burial place of Adam, giving a beautiful juxtaposition between the fall and the redemption of mankind. In this image, blood from the cross flowed first to the grave of Adam before flowing out to redeem all humanity. My tendency is to think of this more as symbolic than actual, but it is possible that Jewish tradition ascribed this as the burial place of Adam, and it was named after his skull. A third possibility brings us back to David. Another rather obscure passage talks about David bringing Goliath's head to Jerusalem. It is possible that the name Golgotha remembers this event and the location of the giant's skull. A fourth and more broad possibility also relates to linguistics. I'm no expert on language, but the word for skull in Hebrew is related to a lot of other words and place names in the Bible. Both Galilee and Gilgal come from similar roots. Gilgal is especially interesting since there seemed to be a few different locations with that name in the Bible. It's possible that it refers to a specific type of place. And if that's the case, it's possible there was a Gilgal near Jerusalem, and perhaps the name Golgotha was a linguistic variation or memory of that. It's also possible that none of these are correct, but I think they're all interesting possibilities. Other things in this chapter, like the casting of lots, the hyssop, and the sour wine, all deserve mention as significant in the historical context, as well as the type of tomb used. But today we're just going to mention them and move on. Chapters 19 and 20 place a significant emphasis on the women in Jesus' life. The only people at the cross who are mentioned by name are women. And Jesus' concern for the women in his life is demonstrated when he uses some of his last strength to tell his disciple, presumably John, to care for his mother, Mary. I like to think that perhaps that action impacted the accounts in this book. The story of the miracle at Cana seems like it must have come straight from Mary. It is also women who first discover the resurrection. Mary of Magdala is recorded in this book as the first to see the risen Christ, and Jesus sends her to tell the other disciples, giving her the privilege of being the first to proclaim the resurrection, which earns her the name Apostle to the Apostles. Chapter 20 concludes with the story of Thomas and a call to belief that has been a theme throughout the book. Chapter 21 seems to be a sort of footnote, quite possibly added by a different author at a later time. It brings us back to the shores of Galilee for one last miracle. So I'm going to leave you with this image of a peaceful morning, the water of the lake gently lapping against the shore, a fire for cooking fish, and we can all imagine Peter's joy at finally being reconciled with his living friend and Savior. And this brings us to the end of our consideration of the book of John, which is not to say there isn't more worth our consideration, but we have reached our goal of giving a little historical and geographical context to the gospel. My hope is that these videos can continue to be useful to people as they prepare to study or teach through the book of John.